Whether reason will prevail depends only partly upon us. We must hope and strive for the best. We must prepare for the worst.
Thanks for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. I'm Nathan Kiker, along with my co-host, George Bogdan. Our guest today is a master of unearthing the titans and enigmas of history. He's a New York Times bestselling author and host of the hit podcast, Dedicated. His newest book, The Lost Empire of Emanuel Nobel, is a story of revolution, oil, and a family empire that rivaled the Rockefellers, yet was nearly erased from history. Doug Brunt, thanks for joining the show.
Great to be here, Nathan. Thanks.
I think everyone knows Alfred Nobel because of the Nobel Prize, the genocides, which he led to via dynamite and the creation of a lot of weapons. But tell us about Emanuel Nobel. I don't think many people know who he was. Let's just start broad.
The whole Russian side of the Nobel family is far less known, although they really achieved far more even than Alfred did. It started with the grandfather coming over, escaping bankruptcy in Stockholm, Sweden, and he went to the Russian Empire to make his new fortune, leaving his family behind, his wife and 3 kids. One of the 3 kids he left behind was Alfred Nobel, by the way. He was a small boy at that time. And the grandfather was a sort of an ingenious tinkerer, inventor type of many different things. The one thing that actually caught hold in the Russian Empire at that time was selling these undersea mines that he had designed to the Tsar, and they were used in the Crimean War. When he got his first big contracts to sell these mines to the Russian military, he then sent for his wife and 3 boys who joined him in Russia near St. Petersburg and continued this factory. It was a machine factory building boilers for steam engines, munitions and mines and grenades and things like that. At the end of the Crimean War in the 1850s, the Russians lost, obviously, and all these huge contracts that they had taken out with the Nobel factory, they did not honor. So he ended up facing bankruptcy due to the contracts being sort of pulled out from under him. And he returned to Sweden with his wife, and the 3 boys who were, by this time, in their 20s, stuck around, sort of picked up the pieces. Alfred eventually did leave and return to Sweden as well and continued to work on dynamite with the grandfather, which he, of course, invented and was very successful in establishing a multinational business selling dynamite. The other 2 brothers stayed around and rebuilt a new munitions factory and engine factory in the northern part of Russia. And they got this huge order for rifles from the Tsar. They needed 100,000 rifles, and they needed wood to build the shoulder stocks of the rifles. And so the one brother, Robert, went down to southern Russia along the Caucasus near the Caspian Sea, where there was known to be these huge walnut trees. He gets down there, and when he's passing through the area to find the lumber, the timber, he goes through the ancient area of Baku that has, it's the land of the eternal flame, and there are puddles of petroleum pooling on the surface that people skim and use as a lubricant or a salve. And he says, forget this. I've got these 20,000 silver rubles. I'm not going to buy timber. I'm buying oil land. And he does, without even telling his brother, who's the boss, and buys all this land and a refining operation, which, by the way, is very backward at this time. This area in Baku still sort of resembled ancient times. There was no drilling. People were digging the oil out with spades. This was 1873. Standard Oil had been in business already for 3 years by this time. And America had really pioneered much more sophisticated drilling operations and refining operations. And the Nobels were very sophisticated engineers from their work up in St. Petersburg. So they bought the land, they came down, and they introduced all the new technology. They basically copied the American playbook and immediately became one of the world's main oil players. By the late 1870s, they already had done that.
What about his story made you want to write a book about him?
I came across this story because I was working on the prior book about Rudolf Diesel. And Rudolf Diesel invented the diesel engine. He disappeared mysteriously on the eve of World War I. It was a whole crazy thing right at the time when the diesel engine had emerged as the world's great power source and was the only power source that could operate a submarine, in the middle of the Anglo-German naval arms race. And so it was a critical thing. He disappears at this wild time. Within the diesel story, though, the way Rudolf Diesel had licensed the diesel engine was for the exclusive rights to manufacture and market the engine by national territory. And the person who had taken a diesel license for Russia was Emanuel Nobel. So up in their machine shop in St. Petersburg, they became one of the world's leading manufacturers of diesel engines. And so I had this little tangent story with diesel, and I would joke with my editor. Yeah, I mean, it's a joke that many people sort of are aware of, that one person's footnote can be another writer's whole book. And so in this case, one of my own footnotes was my own next book. So this really kind of picks up a thread from the diesel story.
He was 29 years old at this point. How much financial support did Emanuel have in getting his oil venture off the ground from the start?
Quite a lot. He was in a better starting spot than his father or grandfather. The business was a cutthroat. It's a commodity business. There were certainly difficult times. Hitting a big gusher can cut both ways, because all of a sudden you have all this oil, but everyone knows about the gusher, so prices go down, and distribution was very challenging, getting Russia out of that sort of remote area of the Caucasus. But in 1888, when his father passed away, as you say, he was 29, and he runs this entire operation, not only the whole petroleum concern in southern Russia, but the machine shop up in St. Petersburg. By this time, they were large enough. They were nowhere near the size of Standard Oil in 1888, but they were big enough that they were one of the main things going on in the Russian Empire, who was mainly accustomed to sort of exporting grain and other things. Suddenly, the Tsar, at this time, Alexander III, the father of Nicholas II, who's the last Tsar who's famously killed by the Bolsheviks. So Alexander III comes down with his son Nicholas, who's the Tsar-to-be, and his wife, and a whole entourage of hundreds of people. And they're like, we got to kick the tires on this oil thing that's happening down in the Caucasus, which is then, it's modern day Azerbaijan, but then part of the Russian Empire. And so they come down, they tour only the Nobel operations. There are a number of different places, but the Nobels are head and shoulders the leading oil concern in all of the Russian Empire. The Tsar is so impressed with this multi-day visit to the Nobel operations that he offers Emanuel Russian citizenship, which he accepts wisely, because that really sets you up well to sort of do business inside Russia. He's the only Nobel ever to become a Russian citizen. So that was in 1888. Emanuel Nobel, who becomes, sort of the main part of this story going forward, because that's where things really get dicey. Over the next 12 years, Emanuel, who has a very different upbringing, he becomes more of a financier. He's very connected. He's sort of he can be a statesman diplomat type, as opposed to an engineer who's figuring out how to drill oil out of the ground. So he, as a sort of a banker and financier, is very successful in growing the business. Over the next 12 years, from 1888 to 1900, he builds Nobel Brothers Petroleum Company to be larger than Standard Oil. They eclipse Standard by 1900. At the time of the outset of the war in 1914, he's in an even stronger position. He sort of fought off some competition in those intervening years, not to mention some revolutions, the 1905 revolution, which was disastrous up in St. Petersburg and in southern Russia. But he weathers all of those storms so that by 1914, he controls more than half of all Russian oil. At this time, World War I, of course, is our first truly mechanized war. So everybody, all the war chiefs of the great nations need oil. Churchill is trying to figure out how to get wartime access to oil. They all need it. They all need Nobel's oil, and he controls more than anyone in the world at this time. So he becomes a key player in this next decade.
I've seen that he was described as a sort of, not philanthropic, but someone who treated his workers well. They did healthcare. It was not necessarily the cutthroat corporation that exploited their workers. How was he able to create an environment for his workers that fostered things such as respect and decent pay and healthcare, and also make this massive empire?
I think he saw. So you're right. He was very enlightened in his employment practices, even for Western Europe, let alone in the Caucasus, where it was just a brutal place to be. You get lowered into one of these oil wells to fix something. 50% of the time, you're not coming back out. A lot of people died out in the oil fields. And it was a very brutal place and dangerous place to work. I think he was not only a decent person, but he also recognized that it made some business sense to be a good employer. And he built schools and housing and leisure pastime facilities for the workers, such that the employees came to call themselves Nobelites proudly. It was the place to work. It was the one you wanted to be working for. And this also paid some dividends when there were various uprisings and revolts. The Stalin, who was the neighbor down there, he grew up in the country of Georgia, and Stalin actually worked the oil fields of the Rothschild family in Russia, who was the other sort of the next largest Russian petroleum player, was the Rothschild concern out of the French side of the family, and for the Nobels. And Stalin, famously in the early 1900s, becomes an agitator in southern Russia, in this region. And when there were revolts and sabotage and damage, the Nobels really got off easy because the employees were loyal. They're like, no, Emanuel Nobel is a good guy. This is the one we should preserve and protect. The Rothschilds, because they were a little less so in the sort of benevolent employment practice. But the other piece of it, though, is they are Jewish. And so they were, Europe generally was anti-Semitic, and Russia was particularly bad in this era. And so the Rothschilds, as a Jewish-run business, got the worst of the sabotage. But the Nobels really got off easy.
I'm fascinated by, kind of the story of someone who really pulled off, I think, the ultimate kind of reputational flip, right? Because, you could say that the product he's known for, causes terrible destruction. And yet, the prize that every sort of big personality in world affairs hankers for in science or in peace building. So
yeah.
they want that. And, I'll never forget when I was graduating with my doctorate, they had just opened the Sackler Humanities Library at Oxford. And I loved going in there. Of course, I think that they fell short where Mr. Nobel has succeeded. But in any case, is that part of the dynamic that you think was in his legacy building? And is it a cause for any skepticism, or, how do you see that?
Well, that's an amazing story in the book. So Alfred is the uncle of Emanuel. So he's separate from the petroleum concern, although he was an investor as well, and sort of an advisor because he had started this international dynamite business. So he knew how to run a multinational business. So he was sort of an advisor and an investor when Emanuel needed some funds to, expand more storage or distribution facilities for the oil coming out of southern Russia. But there's the grandfather, then there's the three brothers, Ludwig, Robert, and Alfred. So Alfred goes back to Sweden and starts dynamite. The other two stay in Russia and do the munitions and the oil. When Ludwig dies, he's the father of father of Emanuel. He dies in 1888. And that's when Emanuel takes over the business and greets the Tsar. Ludwig was a famous guy. The history of Emanuel Nobel has really been erased. That what happened to Emanuel Nobel after the Bolshevik Revolution, what Stalin did to him, was the inspiration for George Orwell's 1984. The street names are changed, the statues are taken down, the history is rewritten. The Nobel Brothers Petroleum Company was taken over and called the Soviet Petroleum Company. The machine shop in St. Petersburg was no longer the Ludwig Nobel machine shop, it was Ruski Diesel. So they renamed everything. Even Ericsson had a telegraph company in St. Petersburg that they took over and called Red Dawn. And Stalin, of course, renamed cities and all of it. So they rewrote the history of the Nobels. They turned them into unpersons. But in 1888, they were world famous. They were well known. Everyone knew they had an oil concern nearly as large as Standard. And so when Ludwig Nobel died, it was big news internationally. Alfred Nobel is running his dynamite business back in France at the time. He wakes up the next day alive and well, and the French newspapers screwed it up. They wrote the obituary of Alfred Nobel, even though it was Ludwig who had died, his brother. And so Alfred wakes up feeling good and reads his own obituary, which calls him a merchant of death, and that he has caused more death and destruction than anyone in history. And so he thinks, my God, this cannot be how I'm remembered. So he rewrites his will to establish the prizes, to bequeath a prize on someone who's done the most to benefit humanity in the prior year. So that's the origin of the prize, is Alfred reading his incorrect obituary. It's actually Ludwig who died, Emanuel's father. Now, that was 1888. In 1896, Alfred does die. And the prizes are established in his new will. And he dies with about 33 million kroner. And 31 go to the prize, 2 go to the family. And the family's sitting back, wait a minute. We were expecting way more than this. What is this prize we're talking about here? Alfred didn't have any kids. We had plenty of nieces and nephews and cousins and other family who all wanted the money. And the King of Sweden also wanted the money to go to the family. He thought Alfred was unduly influenced by the pacifist movement. You got to fully lay down your arms. He's like, look, we can't lay down our arms. We got to defend ourselves. And I think your uncle was too much with the pacifist thing. And so Emanuel was the custodian of the will. And in Russia, the word for that actually translates to custodian of the soul. which Emanuel took very seriously as a responsibility to his uncle, Alfred. And so he has a meeting with the king of Sweden and tells the king to shove it. He says, nope, I'm not going to listen to you and change the will and give the money to the family. I'm going to follow through with this prize. Then he gets a whole meeting together with the family and convinces them all, we need to honor what Alfred wanted. These were his last wishes. We need to establish the prize. And so it's years of litigation and wrangling, and Emanuel does prevail, though, and the first prize is, as you guys I'm sure know, goes out in 1901. And Emanuel, in his typical fashion, always puts Alfred's name forward. So Emanuel lives decades longer. He's involved with the prize and the selection and how it's all orchestrated and the investments of the money to keep the prize cashed up, but never puts his name forward. And it always promotes Alfred and puts his name in lights. So the sort of gilded legacy of Alfred Nobel, which, of course, the Rockefellers and the Sacklers, they all want to gild their legacy a little bit with these philanthropic things at the 11th hour. Emanuel didn't do that for himself, but he did make sure that Alfred came out looking pretty good there in the end.
Agree. Yeah.
It's noted that, and you've noted this as well, that Stalin saw Emanuel as the embodiment of everything he wanted to destroy. Why did Stalin have such a personal disdain for him?
I was just thinking about this the other day. Do you guys remember that movie with Matt Dillon? I can't remember the name. I have to look it up at some point, but there's a train that goes by and he's sort of like, he grows up on the other side of the tracks and there's this train that goes by with this shipping this product of a very massive company and the name sticks in his head. Somehow he meets the daughter of the
talented Mr. Ripley.
It's very similar to that. It might be A Kiss Before Dying. Is that a Matt? Whatever. Anyway, but that idea, talented Mr. Ripley, is exactly right. And so Stalin grows up as a neighbor. Many of the people he knows, hard scrabble streets. He's basically a street gangster, getting his butt kicked in street fights every day, going to school. He then goes to study to be a priest, of all things. Stalin was on a path to be a priest. He does abandon all that, but he had a very rough childhood. His mother was essentially at times a prostitute. His father was an abusive alcoholic. A rough go as a youth. Many of the people in the area where he grew up did go out and work for these oil companies. And you want to talk about a wealth gap. No more extreme than the Caucasus region, where you have certain petroleum owners literally building their house out of plated gold. It's insane. And then other people who are, risking their lives every day to go out in the oil fields and getting paid virtually nothing, living in huts with dirt floors and things like that. So he watched this extreme gap in wealth with the petroleum companies down along the Caspian Sea near where he grew up. So he just sort of had a front row seat to it. And then as he gets more involved with the Bolshevik movement, he becomes Lenin's main man in southern Russia to foment unrest and agitation in places like Baku, which is the sort of heart and soul of the they call that the oil city in those days. So he just, I think by proximity, that was part of it.
Wealth envy and wanting to beat up on the rich, probably more handsome neighbor. Lenin also got involved and sent a message that Nobel had to come to Russia to help nationalize the industry. How did Emanuel Nobel respond to that?
He did not respond to Lenin and Stalin, who summoned Citizen Nobel. Stalin was saying, we got to take over the oil, we got to do it. Lenin was a little more hesitant, saying, well, fine, we can take it over, but we don't know how to operate it. The production is going to trickle down to nothing if we don't get some cooperation from the people who are currently keeping these existing production levels. We're going to need cooperation from the industry to then take it over. Some experts are going to have to stay on the ground there. So they summoned Nobel to Moscow, which is the new capital, where Lenin moved it from St. Petersburg, to Citizen Nobel, come help us with this nationalization of the oil industry, which he does not do. But instead, he writes a letter to Balfour, who's the foreign secretary for Great Britain, who's leading the British delegation at the peace talks in Versailles to end World War I. And he said, there's an ongoing Russian civil war, the Red Army versus the White Army. And Stalin and the Red Army and the communists are coming for Baku. They need the oil. If you want to run a war in this era, you got to have oil. It's more important than food, practically. So he writes to Balfour in the spring of 1919, and they're wrapping up the peace talks. And he says that if Lenin and Stalin don't get oil by August, they're done. The Red Army is going to choke out for lack of oil. They are coming to Baku, that is presently held by British troops, but only about 1,200 troops. It's called the Dunster Force, this British commander, Lionel Dunsterville, who became a character in Kipling novels. But it's not enough. The Red Army is way bigger than that. So he says to Balfour, you need to reinforce your position here because they're coming and they're going to take over the oil. And Balfour at this time, and Churchill, of course, recognizes, Churchill's arguing the same thing. Like, we got to get in there with 100,000 troops. We can go nip this whole Bolshevik communist thing in the bud. It'll never happen. But there's no appetite in Britain. They've spent 4 years. They're in this war. They're in massive debt. They haven't even spent much on social programs that are grossly underfunded. And too many of Britain's sons have been dying over the last 4 years. There's no appetite to send troops into Russia, of all places, which is just such a chaotic mess. And there was also the thought that these Bolsheviks, they couldn't possibly last anyway. Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin have never run anything in their lives, let alone a massive empire. Within weeks, a few months at the most, these guys are going to blow themselves up. We don't need to do anything because they're going to fall apart anyway. So he said no troops. And Emanuel Nobel's prediction to Balfour in the letter is 100% correct. Stalin, the Red Army arrives, they kick everybody out, they take over the oil, and then have the oil to supply their ongoing civil war, which they win.
I'm reminded that the title of Jürgen's sort of magisterial book on oil, the prize comes from that expression from Winston Churchill. The prize is mastery itself. And I think from that kind of expression, you get Jürgen's, meta thesis that to understand the 20th century, you really have to understand oil, and oil might be a kind of guiding sort of, aspect of factor in the 20th century history. Do you come away with, having done your research, sort of believing that's the case, or are you more critical of it? I mean, Jürgen was writing in the late 80s when all the Soviet archives were, of course, closed, and they're still, not terribly accessible, but I mean, has more emerged such that it's a more complicated picture? How would you paint that kind of narrative?
Now, lots to say on that. One thing is Daniel Jürgen wrote some praise for this book. So he's my first endorsement. Love Jürgen. And I have behind me, since we'll dip back into to that. So that's the one I had in college. I think it came out like 91 or something like that. So yeah, you're right. He was writing through the 80s because there's no way that wasn't a multi-year endeavor.
Beautiful.
Amazing. One of the best books ever. What we're talking about here in southern Russia, this is really the first oil war between the Rothschilds, Rockefellers, Nobels to establish global dominance in petroleum. And it's the story of our times. Every newspaper you open, to almost any page, for generations, the race, the competition to capture sources of energy is the story of our times, and has been. So this story echoes through to the present day, what happened in Venezuela, what's happening in the Middle East. Russia has other sources of oil now in eastern and western Siberia. It's not only Baku and Azerbaijan. There's offshore drilling, which of course didn't exist in 1910. But it's so in this era, Mexico was only just coming online. That was more like 1909, 10, before they really started getting into production going. Middle East, around the same time. I think Churchill first got in there with what became British Petroleum later. By the war, that was sort of up and running a little bit. But yeah, all the themes echo from generations before Daniel Jürgen came out with the prize through to the present day. It's still petroleum, which is one of the interesting things about the diesel book is it wasn't really a settled thing that petroleum would be the fuel. What Rudolf Diesel was arguing with the diesel engine was to run it off of agrarian products. Like it could be nut oil or vegetable oil can run the diesel engine. That's what he wanted. Now, there's a whole different set of infrastructure required. It's not easy to just, sounds great. Oh, peanut oil, that's great. Well, then we need massive peanut farms and massive refining infrastructure to produce enough nut oil to power the diesel engines around the world. And Rockefeller at that time was saying, I've got all this. We've got abundant petroleum coming right out of the ground. We've got all the refining infrastructure. I can sell it at a low price. So he sort of always undermined any business case for nut or vegetable or, like a biofuel. We're trying, it's kind of getting a little traction these days. But yeah, so petroleum becomes the story from, really the founding of Standard Oil in 1870 to the present day.
I mean, and do you think that I see the AI age as really, moving us past some of what I'll call like the Malthusian delusions of like a green, relationship to energy, in the sense that like the less energy you have, the dumber you are, because, AI is just so consumptive of energy. And so, I mean, do you think that's going to sort of really exacerbate or enhance these dynamics, or am I wrong in some of my assumptions? How do you think that's going to play out?
I haven't extrapolated this into data centers exactly yet. I'm still geared around the sort of World War I era. But these data centers, even prior to AI, they were, it processes everything we do on our phones. Now AI sort of dials that up a multiple. And then the energy consumption of these data centers is massive. I gotta hope that our ability to produce energy from other sources can close to keep pace with that. One thing I'm always astounded by is, as much as we talk about electric cars and, the battery life of all that, those things get charged up from somewhere. It tends to be a diesel engine, like if these, a charging station for, a Tesla or some electric car, they charge and they get their electricity, but that electricity behind that is a diesel powered generator producing the electricity that charges the car. So sooner or later down the chain, we're burning fossil fuels in a combustion engine. So it is a big question as these data centers consume more and more and more. Do we start relying more on nuclear? I don't know.
What are your key parallels between 1920 Baku and 2026 Eastern Europe?
I think there's nothing quite like that era of Baku. That city changed hands so many times, and each time was an absolute bloodbath. It went from the Ottoman Turks to the Armenians, each transition genocidal, to the British, to the communists. Each one of these was just utter chaos and like little rivers of blood down the streets. It's a totally multi-ethnic city. One of the things that was so interesting about Nobel's early days there is, he would name the languages he would overhear just walking down the street. There's Finnish, Swedish, Polish, German, Russian, Arabic, all of it. So it's a even more of a melting pot that America has been, but violent, totally violent. Even more so than, and look, there's lots of violence today, but I think the Russian Civil War, nothing compares to that. Worst time and place ever on the planet. 1 million people died in the American Civil War. 10 million died in the Russian Civil War.
That's right. During his lifetime, what do you think were his key accomplishments, and what is his legacy today when we think about Emanuel Nobel?
The deficit of appreciation in his legacy is really one of the reasons I wrote the book. It's like, I can't believe we don't know this guy. He did these extraordinary things. He's completely been turned into an unperson by Stalin. His history's been paved over, and Stalin just painted on a new history. And so his legacy is not what it ought to be. His greatest accomplishments, I think, are taking, he was not the founder. His dad was, but he took a sizable concern and turned it into the number one concern in the world. From 1888, that 12 year, his dad ran the company for 15 years. He ran it for 25. So much longer. And in that first 12-year run, he took it from, one of the big ones to the biggest in the world. His dad never thought they'd ever be bigger than Standard Oil, and he did that. So I think it's sort of a brilliant, I think there are different leadership qualities required at different phases of a business. That there's sort of the founder who's great for a company that's like 0 to 20 folks out of a garage or something small. And then the sort of wild man mentality that makes that work is pretty different from a company that's a few thousand people that has various controls in place. He's just like, he's not meant for that. And I think Emanuel was the right person for the job when the company got to that size.
Fair enough. Fair enough. I have to ask one question about AI because it's the only thing anyone talks about as much as it drives me nuts, which is one, do you ever use it in your writing? That's not good or bad. I'm just curious. And two, do you worry that AI limits people's attention spans so they'll actually want to pick up and read a book about an incredibly important but obscure figure from 20th century Russia?
I have not really used it. I tested it with both the Diesel book and the Nobel book. It's obscure history. There's not a lot out there on these guys, and what out there is often wrong. And so I've tested some things like asking a question about Nobel, and it almost always comes back wrong. And one of the things about the work that I'm doing that's insulated from AI just taking, I mean, I think AI can write a Harlan Coben novel pretty well. You just say, write me this, and that in the voice of Harlan Coben. Out it comes in 1 second. We're like, well, it's actually not bad. As good as Harlan. And then this, though, a lot of the material is in a dusty box in an archive in Stockholm or somewhere else. And AI can't get its little tentacles in there, and no one has scanned it in anywhere yet. And which is why when you ask some of these questions, it's wrong. I will ask some questions like, what was the date that Lenin said this or that? And, when did George Washington, give a speech? Or that stuff is very well established in the historical record. It's there. It's pretty accurate. So I can find out little snippets of information that I, when I was in high school in the 80s, would have had to pull the encyclopedia off my dad's shelf and do that. So that saves me a lot of time. Does it shorten attention span? I mean, the competition for books is, I don't know if it's AI so much. I mean, there is a conditioning for like immediacy, I guess. But I view the competition for books as mainly the streamers. It's like, am I going to start this show on Netflix or am I going to pick up a book? And every time I see another person write a great book, I'm thrilled because I think that helps the book category generally. I don't view other writers as my competition. I view them as my allies. If David Grann writes a terrific follow-up to The Wager, I'm going to be like, go David Grann, because then that's a few million people had a great experience with a book and they're going to go into their bookstore and say, show me another one like this. I want to do that again, as opposed to clicking to the next. And so, conversely, every time someone puts out a horrible Netflix series, I'm like, great, put out another crap Netflix series, because maybe people finally get sick of it and pick up a book again.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. In many ways, you're a treasure hunter and you're trying to pull out these pieces of treasure from the archives, as George does as well with his research. I'm curious a little more about that process for being in the archives. What is the most effective way to find these little tidbits of history and to really tell those stories? Or is there any secret sauce?
I don't know that there's a secret sauce. I mean, the main secret sauce is to be obsessed with it, to really love it. I mean, when I love picking up old books. I mean, you can see I'm surrounded by books. A lot of them are old. I love the smell of it, like the glue and the binding and all that stuff. I love all of that. And so it's like you have to love the nerd side of Indiana Jones as opposed to the leather whip side. And because I'll come across something in the archives. Preparedness is a big thing, I think. You need to sort of be fairly steeped in the story when you first get in there, because it's, they bring all this stuff out. If you're starting like really at a standing start, it's kind of hard to get into it. You need to just have a sense of what you're looking for to navigate it around. And then when you come across something that is relevant to the story, like there are a number of things you could come across, and most people are like, whatever, that's I guess kind of interesting. But in the context of my story, I'm like, wow, this is so great. Like Nobel wrote this letter to Balfour about Stalin as he's coming down. Like a lot of people are like, Nobel wrote a letter to Stalin from southern Russia and then it arrived in Versailles and whatever. Like that's kind of out there, but in the context of story, it's like, it's really interesting. It brings a lot of pieces of it together. So I think, there are a lot of different ways to go about getting a foundation that makes the time in the archive more useful. One of the great places to start, I think, is to read memoirs of people from the era. There are, the French diplomats in St. Petersburg, the American ambassador. These people were there as people were rushing the streets in the February Revolution, then again in October in 17. And their accounts are made. They'll have a little observation of like something happened, like some kind of street post, but it like brings the image right to your brain. And so some of those are just hugely helpful in bringing the whole thing to life.
Yeah.
And then some secondary resources are also great. But once you're really read in, getting into the archives, you can really make the best use of that time.
So your book is coming out this month. What day and where can folks get it?
May 19, and you should be able to get it anywhere. It was an Amazon editor's pick of the month for May, and it was an Apple Books pick of the month for May. And I read the audio. So if you're an audiobook reader, I went through that surprisingly challenging process. It was not easy.
Well, congratulations on all of that, and we look forward to reading it.
Thank you. Thanks so much, guys.
Thanks again for joining this episode of Clearer Than Truth. Be sure to tune in next time and share with your friends.